Welcome to the Florida Historical Society 2021 Virtual Public History Forum. I'm Ben Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society, and while it appears that the COVID-19 pandemic is ending, it's not quite over yet, but I think you'll find that even though we're meeting in this format and not in person, we still have assembled an impressive group of Florida historians, history makers, and subject area experts. We're also going to have our annual award ceremony and an exciting keynote speaker. It's going to be a great conference over the next 3 days, and here to offer her welcome to you is Florida Historical Society President Emily Liska.
Welcome to the Florida Historical Society Public History Forum, an exploration of significant and timely topics. First, I want to thank you for joining with us. It means so much, and we hope to continue to see you as an active member of the Florida Historical Society. Take a look online and become one of those active members. Also, thank you to Ben Brotemarkle and his outstanding staff at the Florida Historical Society. Their creativity and tireless efforts to present this spring forum never cease to amaze me. The speakers and topics include the Jillian Prescott Memorial Lecture featuring Gilbert King, and also 4 timely panel discussions. We offer outstanding academics who will provide fresh research and insights. And of course, as always, special appreciation is in order for the board of directors. Along with the staff, the directors have ensured the existence of the longest running cultural organization in Florida. Again, sit back, enjoy, and become one with Florida history. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Beginning this year, the Florida Historical Society is hosting 2 major conferences annually. Each October, we'll be meeting in Orlando on the campus of the University of Central Florida in conjunction with the Gerald Schaffner Lecture on Florida History and Culture. The focus of that event will be on academic paper presentations. Every May, we'll be hosting the Florida Historical Society Public History Forum in a different Florida city each year. In the mornings, we'll have panel discussions at keynote speakers. Every afternoon, we'll be going out to historical museums, historical sites, and taking advantage of cultural events. We'll also have our awards presentation in May and much more. It's not too early to mark your calendar for May 19th through 21st, 2022, when we'll be in Gainesville. We'll be at the Hilton Conference Center on the campus of the University of Florida in Gainesville, and we'll have all sorts of special events. We'll be right across the street from the Harn Museum of Art, which has a really special collection of Florida art. It's also across from the Florida Museum of Natural History, so it's really going to be a special event. We have a special event for you this year too as well though, with our 2021 Florida Historical Society Virtual Public History Forum. Later today, we'll be talking about Emancipation Day in Florida, which is today, May 20th. But first is our Public History Forum discussion on Territorial Florida in 1821.
Welcome. My name is Mike Denham, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to our Florida Historical Society panel discussion on the Florida Territory in 1821. And I'm here with 4 panelists that I'm going to be introducing. They're very well-known scholars in their fields, and I'd like to start. What I plan to do is introduce them first, and with each of their topics that they're going to be looking at. And then I'm going to say a few words about the Florida Territory as it founded and created the first few years of the Territory, and kind of get us ready to explore various aspects of the Florida Territory. And let me go ahead and introduce those individuals now. I'm going to begin with Jim Cusick, who is curator of the Pecan Library at the University of Florida. He's a well-known scholar of the second Spanish period and early Florida history, and has written widely and done much research on that topic in Florida history. and he is going to be sharing with us the aspects of 1821 in Pensacola and things going on in Pensacola around that time in 1821. Our next presenter is equally a wonderful scholar of this time frame. Her name is Susan Parker. She is executive director of the St. Augustine Historical Society for many years, and she has written widely and deeply in this time frame in Florida history, and her specialty is Spanish East Florida, and she is currently clerk historian to the St. Johns County Clerk of the Court, and she works with the general public in bringing a lot of their older documents to the general public, and of course is involved in doing museum exhibits and so forth. Our next presenter is Jason Herbert, who is affiliated with the Florida Seminole Tribe, and he is actually a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, but is currently working as ethnographer for the Seminole Tribe. He's working now on a dissertation on Florida cattle, particularly the Seminole Tribe and Florida cattle, with Florida cattle from 1519 to 1858. He's going to be sharing information and research on Seminole cattle aspects of Seminole cattle in the early 1800s. Our final presenter is going to be a gentleman by the name of Canter Brown, who should be well known to the audience. Canter Brown has written widely on 19th century Florida, all aspects really of early 19th century Florida, and so forth. His most recent book is a biography of Henry Plant, but today he's going to be sharing insights into the African-American presence in the Florida Peninsula about the time of American acquisition of Florida. His research and his consulting has led to many discoveries regarding a new village, or at least a newly discovered village of Angola, which is of course near Bradenton, or within the city limits of Bradenton. And he is going to be sharing with us today information about those aspects of Florida. So what I'd like to do now is say just a few things, some basic facts, I guess, to get us started on the territory itself. Everyone, of course, watching this panel, I'm sure, is familiar with the First Seminole War and the process by which Florida became an American territory, Andrew Jackson's role in creating, or at least invading, Spanish Florida, which triggered a series of reactions which resulted in the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was signed with Spain in 1821. The treaty itself was ratified in 1821, and Andrew Jackson himself was appointed commissioner to actually receive the formal transfer of the territory in Pensacola from the Spanish. And then, of course, some other highlights, of course, that are going to be going on during this time frame is Jackson will actually receive that transfer on July 17th, 1821. He would resign in October and return to Tennessee. And almost simultaneously with this resignation, the person who would eventually become governor of Florida, William Pope Duval, would come to St. Augustine, not as governor, but as a judge. So he would arrive in St. Augustine in November 1821. And interestingly, he would actually come to St. Augustine's back door. He would not come by boat directly to St. Augustine. He would actually come to Jacksonville, or present-day Jacksonville, and paddle with his brother-in-law all the way down the St. Johns River and to a place called Piccolata, and ride a horse to St. Augustine from there, from the St. Johns River. And in that process, he would report what he found, the native people. He would write back to John Quincy Adams, who was, of course, Secretary of State. And within a very short time after he met his first session of court, he would go back to Washington, lobby for the job, and he was actually appointed the first governor of Florida. And he would actually come to St. Augustine, come to Pensacola after President James Monroe signed an act creating the Florida Territory, which stipulated all the different aspects of the territory. The governor appointed by the president, a legislative council appointed by the president, and again, established the territory under American control. He would leave Pensacola, that is Duval, and then of course later the next year arrive in St. Augustine and oversee the second meeting of the Legislative Council. And while there in St. Augustine, he would commission two individuals, William Simmons from St. Augustine and John Williams from Pensacola, to meet together at an appropriate spot to build a territorial capital. Pensacola and St. Augustine, the two major towns in the territory, they would find a meeting place for a state, for a new territorial capital. By March of 1824, Duval would proclaim this site that they would find the capital of the new territory. So with those basic facts, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Jim Cusick, who's going to tell us about what was going on in Pensacola at this time. Jim?
All right, well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to the Florida Historical Society for hosting this panel. I think most historians would agree that modern Florida began or had its inception with the Age of Jackson. And Andrew Jackson came to Florida 3 times, all 3 times to Pensacola. He captured Pensacola during the War of 1812. He captured it again when he was prosecuting the First Seminole War in 1818. And then he came to Pensacola as Florida's first American governor in 1821. And his tenure as our governor was relatively brief. He took up his post in May of 1821, actually from Alabama. He was not formally installed as governor until the official changing of the flags, which took place on July 17, 1821. And he then made Pensacola his headquarters. And he quickly grew disenchanted with being governor of Florida, and by October of 1821 was already back in Tennessee, having resigned his post, where his friends were already grooming him for a run at the presidency. So he was in office for about 5 months. But what I want to focus on is 4 things that happened during those 5 months that I think set the tone for what American Florida was going to be like. And the first thing that I would mention is that during his tenure, Jackson held an embassy, an audience, with representatives of Native Americans in Florida. And he met with Neamathla, whose territory was around Tallahassee. And Neamathla was a Creek Indian who had previous experience, mostly hostile experience, with Andrew Jackson. And Jackson was actually grilling him on how many Creeks and Miccosukees were settled in Florida and where they were. Neamathla was seeking reassurance about what was going to happen. And he very quickly, I think, found out that he was still dealing with the man that was known among the Creek and Seminole as Sharp Neck. This was the man who had expropriated 21 million acres of Creek territory during the Treaty of Fort Jackson, and who had hung a very prominent Creek leader, the Prophet Francis, during the First Seminole War. And Neamathla walked away from that meeting with no assurance whatsoever that native land rights in Florida would be respected, and only with a statement that the native peoples would be, quote unquote, collected together in a place so that they could be better protected. And I think that meeting very much set the tone for what the relations were going to be between the state of Florida, or the territory of Florida, the United States government, and the various native peoples, Seminole, Miccosukee, and Creek in Florida. A second thing that happened in those 5 months was that Andrew Jackson was very eager and anxious to Americanize Florida and to eliminate any vestiges of former Spanish culture here. And that showed prominently in his feuding with the outgoing Spanish governor, Jose Maria de Callava. In particular, Jackson prompted Callava to turn over the files in a legal case that Jackson wanted to try involving inheritance rights. And when Callava refused to turn over that case, Jackson forcibly confiscated the papers from Callava's house, had a heated argument with him, arrested him, and threw him in the jail in Pensacola, and then proceeded to preside over that case himself under American law. The third thing that was significant, I think, was that case, because it was a case that was brought by a free woman of color named Mercedes Vidal. And she was charging that she and her sister had been cheated out of their inheritance, and she wanted the case re-adjudicated and their rights re-examined. And it's a significant case because it occurred just a few days, few weeks really, after Florida had become an American territory. And so it was the first testing of the American legal system by a free person of color living in Florida. And in this particular case, the judgment went in favor of Mercedes Vidal. However, this was just the first of many cases that free blacks were going to have to bring in court in Florida in defense of their rights as citizens and in defense of their property rights. And in many of those cases, they found that the law was very much slanted against them rather than in their favor. And then the fourth and final thing I would mention is that Jackson made law while he was governor. He passed a number or enacted a number of ordinances which set up the city governments of St. Augustine and Pensacola, established the regulations of the custom house, established the counties and the county court system, and laid out the rules under which the county courts would operate. And there was even an ordinance specifying that the Christian Sabbath was to be attended with appropriate decorum throughout Florida. Now, other people really had to carry out and implement these ordinances and this framework that Jackson laid out, because soon after he passed these ordinances, he, as I said, was ready to resign from his office and move on. But I think in retrospect, if you look at the 5 months that he was in office as governor, what we can say is that Jackson moved with his typical vigor to change the trajectory of Florida and to move it from being a former Spanish borderland to being a society that would evolve into a part of the American Deep South. And that his initial influence as governor played very much a role in initiating that process. So I hope that kind of lays a groundwork for what other panelists want to say about this transitional period in Florida's history.
That was great, Jim. And I wonder if any of the presenters, the other presenters, have any comments or questions on that. I'd like for people to ask questions if they have those questions. If we do have any comments or questions on Jim's comments, would someone like to say anything? Or otherwise, we'll defer then to Susan Parker. I'm not sure that I've properly introduced what her topic was going to be. Susan Parker is going to share with us events going on in St. Augustine on the other side of the territory. And so, Susan, can you kind of take it from there?
I can, thank you. And I'm pleased to be with all of you this afternoon. people on this panel are wonderful scholars. They're also old friends of mine, and I've made one new friend with Jason. So I'm very pleased to be here with all of you. And yes, I'm on the east side of, all the way on the other side of Florida. St. Augustine, excuse me, had been transferred to the United States 1 week before Pensacola on July 10th, 1821. And I'm going to focus on what it meant, or what I think it meant, and how the citizens and other people that came into St. Augustine reacted to this change. And so Jim's comments were really a good prelude to that for me. Because the transfer in St. Augustine on July 10th was peaceful, but the acceptance of the transfer by the population was not. And I think that's true for Pensacola for a while as well. I want to give you just a few words out of Jackson's address to the citizens on July 10th. He wrote, "The authority of Spain has ceased, and that of the United States of America is established over the same. The inhabitants will be incorporated into the Union of the United States. I exhort and enjoin all inhabitants to be faithful and allegiant to the United States and obedient to its laws." The Spanish governor of East Florida, Jose Coppinger, had written a similar farewell address with some admonitions to the citizens, but his was in a much different tone. It was a farewell address. He knew the people he was talking to. He'd been among them 5 or 6 years. And it was also sort of a typically different cultural way of addressing people. It was in a sense much more affectionate and reflects both those men's personalities, but also their roles. And so I'm going to go into what I think is a little bit of a dangerous enterprise, and that is to try to read the minds of people from 200 years ago, because I do such a poor job of reading the minds of the people that I live with. So I will try that anyway. And so I want to try to put you a bit in the role of the residents that were here, that have been here a long time, when St. Augustine on July 10th became American. The residents who were here at that time, who were in their 50s, would have seen the previous transfer of the colony from Britain to Spain. So they were now in their second transfer. And if we had some really old people here, there might have even been someone who had seen it go from Spain to Great Britain, but I doubt that. The persons that I'm talking about in their 50s would have been teenagers at the time of the transfer to Spain, and they would have been born in British St. Augustine. During the transfer, the residents of the town could not see the actual signing of the act of transfer, which took place in Government House, but the public could watch the lowering of the Spanish flag and the raising of the US flag at the Castillo de San Marcos, the marching out of the Spanish soldiers, and the entry of the American soldiers into the fortress. The people in St. Augustine who did get to see the act of transfer signed by both Jose Coppinger and Colonel Robert Butler, who was the American representative, were 5 city council members. They were in attendance at that act of the signing of the transfer, and also the delivery of the key of the city gate to Butler. They had just lost their political standing and authority, similar actually to the way that we see people lose their political standing today when we have a transfer of power after an election. And now the Americans were in charge. The new officials were American. They were not longtime Florida residents. The officials in St. Augustine that had been in St. Augustine were being supplanted. Most of the officials appointed for Florida, either one, were political paybacks, and all did not go smoothly with the assumption of American authority. For one reason, the appointees were slow to arrive for a number of reasons, and they also arrived as yellow fever came into the town. And even after the officials arrived, some of them did not live very long, leaving voids in the brand new government. One official wrote that several of the new appointees found themselves now in a watery grave rather than sitting in an office. And of course, he's no doubt referring to St. Augustine's very high water table, which would make its appearance as you dug a burial pit. The Americans, of course, blamed the yellow fever on the Spanish that were leaving, saying that the illness, which we now know is a virus, but they did not, had arrived in the Spanish vessels that had come from Havana to take people back to Cuba that were part of the Spanish staff in St. Augustine. I would expect that many of the St. Augustinians in 1821 on July 10 could still recall that the Americans had invaded their territory only 9 years earlier and savaged Northeast Florida, burning most of the countryside, as Jim Cusick points out so well in his book, The Other War of 1812. St. Augustine was spared, but little else was. Francisco Jose Fecho's home, and Francisco Jose Fecho had been one of those councilmen, had been burned, and part of his family had escaped in a boat in 1812. Then the invaders exhumed the remains of the family patriarch and spread them around. Who could forget an experience or a memory like that? Some of the most immediate concerns of the residents were, would they be able to keep the land that they owned? And would they be able to worship as they had been accustomed to for decades? One of the concerns, there were several concerns about this, especially the religious aspect, for this was really a time of Hispanophobia in the US and not just aimed at Florida. Historian Elijah Gould recently remarked that Spain in 1820 was public enemy #1 of the US. The Spanish were an obstacle to America's ambitions to spread across the continent. And the late David Weber wrote, this is quite a list, he said that the Americans considered the Spanish to be unusually cruel, avaricious, treacherous, fanatical, superstitious, cowardly, corrupt, decadent, indolent, and authoritarian, which he calls a unique complex of pejoratives. There was deep suspicion of the Spanish and of Catholics. And in this case, in St. Augustine, they were usually inseparable. And it wasn't long, only a few months, before the editor of the St. Augustine newspaper campaigned to try to stop the pre-Lenten carnival festivities, kind of a St. Augustine Mardi Gras, which of course were very popular and had gone on for years. In response, the holdover citizens performed a mock funeral for the editor, complete with placing an effigy of him in the casket. Right away, there were also disruptions among the Americans that would impact the St. Augustinians. The transfer of people did not go really smoothly because the doctor of the army post, the US doctor, immediately declared that Castillo de San Marcos was too unhealthy to be used as a barrack for the soldiers, and that the soldiers had to be placed wherever they might find a space for them in whatever might be US claimed government territory. So you can see right there, it's like, so what is the US government claimed territory? Military and civilian personnel recently arrived from the US brawled with each other over the use of the government buildings and rooms. The city council, which resigned immediately, almost within 2 weeks after the transfer, a new one was elected. The newly elected city council made up its own list of public properties with their suggested uses. And the St. Augustine City Council had to fight to keep their council meeting room from becoming literally a sleeping porch for the US soldiers. In December of 1821, all of the councilmen of this newly elected council, who had been in place really only about 5 months, threatened to resign if they couldn't have their meeting room back. The concern about private land ownership was really bothersome to the holdover residents. Whether or not it was a naive assumption, these new Americans, the holdover residents, longtime Floridians, expected that their land claims would be easily accepted and affirmed quickly and easily by the United States. But they were soon to learn that they thought they were owners, but they found out they were claimants, especially of this, not just of land outside of St. Augustine, but the city lots in St. Augustine and Fernandina. Those claiming owners would have to submit their claim to scrutiny by the US land commissioners, requiring expenditure of sums as well as times of uncertainty. The claims for the homestead grants out in the countryside, usually what we call Spanish land grants, dragged on for quite a while. Many of them dragged on for decades. Disdain for the residents' Catholicism was also a flashpoint. And within 2 years of the transfer, the St. Augustine Catholic parishioners feared they would lose their church to the US government, the church building itself. And that caused quite a squabble, as you can imagine as well. The arriving Americans, excuse me, with the arriving Americans, there was a good bit of effort to focus on the structure of the government, but not really so much on governing. And perhaps that was just a reflection of the times. St. Augustine residents more than once sent petitions to the President of the United States to complain about his appointees or their activities. Perhaps Alexander Hamilton Jr., who was, of course, son of the Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill, who was serving as district attorney in East Florida and was one of the land commissioners, may have received their strongest anger for threatening to use his federal post to punish residents who did not vote for him for territorial delegate. Bernardo Segui, who was the leader of this petition to be sent to the president against Hamilton, was also a leader in the fight to maintain the church. However, I will say a few of the holdover residents of St. Augustine quickly saw the wisdom of accepting American rule. I could think they could see which way this was going to go. The others were just holding on out of affection and their old status. Joseph Hernandez probably made the right choice. He was one of the city councilmen who had resigned soon after transfer, but it wasn't long before he was appointed to be Florida's first territorial delegate to Congress. And there were others as well. So this was and I think Pensacola probably was the same. Jim, that was not what Jim was talking about. This was, if you were a holdover resident, this was not a good time for your land or for your lord. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Are there any questions? If there aren't, I have a question or a comment. Of course, one of the American officials there in St. Augustine at the time in 1823 was William Pope Duval, and he, reading his letters, he seemed to get along a lot better with the Creoles than he did with Hamilton and that crowd. So he seemed to really kind of, hope that they would be brought into this American system, and he soon became friends with the Sanchez family, for example, and others. So anyway, any comments or questions for Dr. Parker? If not, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Herbert, who is affiliated again with the Seminole tribe. He's going to tell us a little bit about the Seminole people at this time and their cattle, which of course was a major asset for that tribe, all the way back, which went all the way back to long before this time. But he's going to focus on that situation at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Talk about the holdover residents in the previous section. Of course, we're talking now about the residents who have always been here in Florida, and that's important too, right? I'm coming to you from Stewart, which is traditional homelands of both the Seminole and of Miccosukee tribe of Indians, and I try to keep that in mind, right? So we can keep these paths between us bright and clean. And what I'm thinking about now is actually going all the way back to 1808. Paupoya, better known as Bowlegs, he opens the door to his cabin and walks across his Alachua Plains to greet his rivals. And like those before him, he says hello. He greets them by the forearm, shakes them by the elbow, and greeting in Hitchiti, "You are come." And his guests that day are traders, but they're far different than the British merchants who had banqueted with Ahia in 1774. Before him stood Juan Bautista Collins and Benjamin Wiggins, the former a shopkeeper and militiaman in St. Augustine, his partner a fellow militiaman whose Spanish father-in-law was stationed on the Alachua Plains. Bowlegs knew the two men. Wiggins undoubtedly had met the headman when he visited with his wife's father and was fluent in Hitchiti, making him an ideal companion for Collins, who had ventured west in search of native cattle. And the day was one of a series of meetings leading up to the eventual sale of native cattle, Bowlegs' livestock, in accordance with customs that Bowlegs both expected and demanded. Collins visited several times to honor the Miko with gifts of cloth, handkerchiefs, belts, beads, sugar, tobacco, aguardiente, knives, shot, powder that would then be redistributed throughout the town's clans, reinforcing the town's relationship with Collins, with St. Augustine, and the Spanish crown, as well as Bowlegs' position as caretaker of his people. And the exchange complete, Collins and Wiggins saddled their horses and with their dogs drove off their newly acquired herd to the next town to barter again. And in many ways, the exchange between Bowlegs, Collins, and Wiggins represented the changing nature of life in Florida in the early 19th century. Ahia had died a little over a decade earlier, and with him, the strong anti-Spanish position of the Alachuas. In his place was Payne as leader of the Alachuas. Payne's younger brother, Bowlegs, stood as both leader of his town and in waiting of the region. And the men who crossed over the St. Johns River and traveled across the Alachua Plains were not white, but mixed race men who likely identified both as Black by themselves and by outsiders. Collins and Wiggins signified that the world itself had come to Alachua. Collins was the son of a Frenchman and a Dominican woman of African descent, while his interpreter was the product of an Anglo-Senegalese coupling. And nor were they the only Black faces in Alachua. By the time of the deal, the color of the land had changed dramatically. Both free and enslaved Blacks were firmly entrenched in Florida Indian country, the result of a revolution that guaranteed new liberties for whites while ensuring the continued oppression of Africans and their descendants north of the border. When Collins and Wiggins rode west across the savannah before turning north and west yet again to other Indian towns, all of them featuring cattle that were not owned by collective town clans, but increasingly by individuals, men and women, who saw the animals as a means of wealth and prestige in their society. The links between chattel ownership of livestock and sometimes other human beings represented a revolution of thought and identity as radical as any of that created in the American Republic. Now, by that time, the Alachua Indians had for 60 years engaged in constructing new cultural, political, and territorial definitions based upon their access to a natural resource unlike any other in the native South, feral cattle. Ahaya, also known by English-speaking contemporaries as Cowkeeper, established the Alachua communities, including a de facto capital of Cuscahuilla sometime around 1750. He'd known the area well. He'd hunted and warred there for decades prior. And according to William Bartram, the young Pennsylvania naturalist who met with Ahaya in 1774, the region boasted over 10,000 head of beef. These were Andalusian descended cattle we call criollos, better known as cracker cattle here in Florida today. And they were the remnants of failed cattle baronies established in the 17th century by the Spanish Empire. Now, it's not that cattle were unique to Florida. Historians, including those on this panel, have demonstrated that the animals were key to imperial construction throughout the Americas. But the Alachua Indians, and a small number of them at that, cornered the market on feral cattle, tells us much about the nature of power in Florida in the early 19th century. By that time, the Alachuas had withstood several advances on their sovereignty, all aiming to capitalize on the pasturage and its economic potential. In 1765, Alachuas, in a meeting with British leaders James Grant and John Stuart, as well as multiple Lower Creek representatives, surrendered a significant chunk of their acreage to the British after Casitas and Ocmulgee ceded lands immediately west of the St. Johns River, where British hoped to establish ranches and plantations. Ahaya's best tactic was actually to send his brother Weofkian instead, hoping that he would be able to barter and be able to negotiate independently later on. But 9 years later, Alachuas flexed their muscle in getting the British to refuse to honor a Lower Creek treaty that would have leased away much of their cattle lands to Georgia trader Jonathan Bryan. The Alachua towns continued to hunt and herd cattle throughout the remainder of the 18th and early 19th century, trading the animals and their beef and their hides and other products with the Spanish Empire via the Panton and Leslie Company, along with smaller traders along the frontier and across the St. Mary's River into the new American Republic. They also welcomed in maroon settlements, and the inhabitants of which likely shaped the ways in which Alachuas managed their herds. Their success was undeniable, and their animals and their land were among those targeted by self-styled patriots in 1812 through 1814. Beginning the first violence against Florida Indians by the United States that has existed in some forms until today. Alachuas helped to beat back the Patriots through at great cost. Payne died as a result of his wounds, and Americans torched hundreds of homes, stole thousands of head stole thousands of bushels of corn, and stole hundreds of horses and cattle. And Alachuas built new settlements along the Suwannee River to the prairies west, where they could still manage their herds, just as Andrew Jackson's army tore through the region again a few years later. By 1823, the Alachuas still maintained control over the region and the herds upon it, though the continual assaults upon their sovereignty had clearly taken its toll. Florida Indians selected Creek Neamathla to be their primary voice in negotiations with the United States at Moultrie Creek. And even then, American promises around a new southern reservation revolved around selling the Indians on its cattle potential. In the South, James Gaston promised, you have lands enough to plant and for the grazing of cattle. And this worked out well for the Indians of the Panhandle, who gained the rights to small reservations near the Apalachicola River. if at least temporarily. But Indians in the central interior reluctantly agreed to herd their animals south to lands untested for the promise of 20 years of peace. As Alachua moved onto a reservation that Governor William Duval called the poorest and most miserable region I ever beheld, white settler colonists moved on to lands that Indians had made viable via their cattle mastery, laying claim even today as the state's historic cattle wranglers. Seeing the Alachua's relationship to cattle and how it defined their sense of identity and political territory allows us to rethink the nature of Alachua and Seminole history itself. Much of it has been about when Indians, namely Alachua Indians, but also Miccosukes and others, stopped being Creeks and started being Seminoles. Traditional understandings hold that Seminole ethnogenesis occurred sometime after the Patriot War, or even into the First and Second Seminole Wars. But I posit that perhaps that by seeing the Alachua's cattle culture as it was allows us to question the ties that bound them to other towns and alliances in the native South. I don't see Alachuas as Creeks at all. Whatever political affiliations they had with other towns were shed upon Alachua's 1750 establishment and reinforced when Alachuas moved to assert their best interests, even when it conflicted with the Creek Confederacy. Creek Tustanucky Flugo in 1812 famously highlighted the Alachua's independence when he complained that they do not follow our rules or go by our orders. They have turned their backs to us. The reality is that Alachua Indians always acted independently of Creek towns because they were always independent of them. Their sovereignty is demonstrated by their continual conflict with Creek towns, often over the natural resource that guaranteed their legitimacy. Alachua's sovereignty throughout the late 18th century and into the early 19th century was written on rawhide.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that. Well, your part in this really kind of dovetails a little bit with our final presenter, and that is Canter Brown, who's going to share with us what was going on in the lower part of the peninsula about this time, particularly with African American or formerly enslaved people, and also, well, free African Americans as well. So Canter, would you like to go ahead and take it from there?
I'd love to. And let me start out by echoing what Susan said. What a treat to see old friends like Jim and Susan and of course, my dear friend here in Lakeland, Mike Denham. And Jason, I enjoyed your presentation and so look forward to getting the chance to talk with you. I get to talk about the other side of this equation that Jim Cusick so brilliantly set up. And that is, I want to show you why descendants of settlers in Florida in 1821 and their friends and admirers detest Andrew. I hope that by doing this, I'll offer some sort of context for those events that Jim detailed as happening in Pensacola in the summer and early fall of 1821. And I got to begin in 1817, 1818. Jim mentioned that Andrew Jackson had, he was kind enough not to use the word invaded Florida 3 times, but the most recent time he had entered Florida was in connection with what we've called the First Seminole War of 1817 and 1818. And that struggle saw Jackson pursuing what were now his enemies, who were either Red Stick Creeks, Upper Creeks that he had fought earlier in Alabama, or Seminoles, some very closely associated with the people Jason was talking about, and then at least 400 Black Maroons who had, many of whom had served in the British Army during the War of 1812, and who were trying to protect their families and getting them out of Jackson's way. In any event, all this culminated in early April 1818 at a fierce battle fought on the Suwannee River near Old Town, called the Battle of the Suwannee. And on that day, 400 reportedly 400 Black warriors fought off Jackson long enough for their families and their allies to escape south of the Suwannee into the peninsula. Now, those groups went to different places, but I'd like to mention three of them in particular. The man who in 1821 is going to succeed as chief of the Seminoles, Cusick, apparently went to a village they've often been called slaves, but so many other names are used for them, vassals or associates of Seminoles and the slaves of Micanopy, at a place called Paliclacaha in Sumter County. So we have a Black village that new life is breathed into in 1821 in Sumter County. The Upper Creeks, under their chief named Peter McQueen, a bitter enemy of Jackson's, went to an old seasonal Seminole hunting town at the principal ford of Peace River that opened the approaches to the South Florida hunting grounds, and not coincidentally, the great Peace River and Kissimmee River cattle ranges. The town was called Talopchaco. We call it Fort Meade. Now, the principal point I want to mention was at Tampa Bay on the Manatee River, where the Maroons who had fought off Jackson's army principally went to seek haven. And they set up a community, or more likely, given the archaeology that has been done in recent years, had been there for years, but now were enhanced by these arrivals at the confluence of the Braden and the Manatee Rivers in what is now essentially downtown Bradenton, called Negro Point. And there they began not only expanding a rich agricultural community, but engaging in diplomatic relations with the Spanish and English empires. They called their settlement, or at least it was called by Cuban fishermen who lived nearby, Angola. Now, as all these events were happening, as these populations were dispersing into the peninsula, Andrew Jackson was seething. He couldn't believe the embarrassment that had accrued to him as a result of the Battle of the Suwannee. So in late 1818, he sent his personal aide, Captain James Gadsden, to Tampa Bay to find out where all these people went. Gadsden reported back with reasonable dispatch that the Red Stick Creeks were on Peace River. Some of the Seminoles were up near present-day Dade City and Brooksville and in other places, but the Blacks were on the Manatee River. Jackson asked Secretary of War John C. Calhoun for permission to take the army to go get them, and Calhoun ordered him not to go. But the idea never left Jackson's mind. In early 1821, with the Adams-Onease Treaty, President John Quincy Adams appoints Jackson the provisional governor. One of the very first letters he sends from Nashville asks for permission to go and get the Blacks at the Manatee River, as well as the Red Stick Creeks on Peace River. Once again, Secretary of War Cal orders him not to go. Almost coincidental with the arrival of that letter catching up to Jackson, who was on his way to Pensacola, a band of 200 or so Lower Creek warriors, Jackson's allies, either led by or under the supervision of Chief William McIntosh, whom Jackson had recently made a brigadier general in the United States Army, set off for Tampa Bay. Following a route that roughly today would be US 301, they came down through those settlements, Jason, in the Chukachattie Hammock near Dade City and Brooksville. They arrived, I'm guessing at night at the Manatee River. Nobody knows. But they were able to attack Angola by surprise and destroy the town or the village. There must have been, according to the accounts that survived, as many as 700 or 750 people living at Angola when the raiders got there. Now, among the raiders, it's important to remember, not only are representatives of, or possibly in person, William McIntosh, Jackson's principal Lower Creek ally, but also William Weatherford, a Red Stick Creek, whom Jackson had taken the surrender of in Alabama back in 1814, and who he had befriended, who had actually lived at his plantation, the Hermitage, near Nashville. Weatherford was personally present. Well, the attack dispersed the settlers at Angola. 150 or 200 made their way to Peace River, where the Red Stick Creeks were still living at Talopchaco. And they went up about 15 miles north of Talopchaco, of Fort Meade, above present-day Bartow, to the eastern side of Lake Hancock, where there was a small Black village called Manatee, or at least it came to be called that. We assume, thanks to Jane Lander's wise advice, that it was a corruption of Manatee. But in any event, some survivors end up under the protection of Red Stick Creeks on Peace River. Another 200 to 250 make their way down the West Coast to the Florida Keys and to eventually Cape Florida, where Bahamian fishermen take them to Andros Island. There, they are allowed by English officials to remain and in time establish the communities of Red Bay and Nicholstown. And their descendants, or at least some of their descendants, remain living in those communities on Andros Island today and treasure family legacies of their involvement in these events all the way back to the Battle of the Suwannee. Now, that leaves about 300 potential men, women, and children unaccounted for. According to a published account written by, quote, eyewitness, those three were seized by the raiders and taken back to slavery in Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee. The trick was that almost half of them disappeared on the way, so that manifests of those slaves that arrived at Fort Mitchell, Alabama, the first point of entry into the United States for them, only list about 170 individuals. Now, it may be a complete coincidence, Jim, that at that very time, Andrew Jackson was transitioning from the log cabin that he was living in on the Hermitage plantation into a beautiful plantation home. And it may be utter coincidence that before he set out for Pensacola, he was desperately writing his agents, I need money. I'm trying to build this house. I need money. Get me some money. In any event, Jackson certainly needed funds if he was entitled to a portion of the slaves who disappeared, and if he sold them and used the funds for his own benefit. Totally speculative on my part. I will point this out, though. If we can jump ahead from 1821, the year in which we're so vitally interested, and in which I think this one event, this raid on Angola, set the stage for important developments in Florida history. 14 years later, it was from that village of Manatee on Lake Hancock, and from the creek town of Talopchaco that Peter McQueen's nephew, he was called Billy Powell when he first arrived at Peace River, but by 1835, of course, we knew him as Osceola, and Harry, the war chief of Manatee, together conspired to provoke the fighting that led to the Second Seminole War. It's no coincidence, I think, that within the opening months of that war, South Carolina volunteers on orders from the U.S. Army had destroyed Paliclacaha, Talopchaco, and Manatee. probably at the time, just before they were destroyed, the largest native settlements in Florida, because they were the havens. Personalities, events, legacies arising out of the year of transition to status of the American territory that had profound impact on Florida going forward. Angola is a remarkable story, but I'm delighted to say that the community in Bradenton and Sarasota and Manatee and Sarasota counties have embraced ongoing archaeological investigations, time and repeatedly are offering incredible new insights into what was there and what was happening. But it's something that, as we discuss 1821 and its importance to Florida history, that we not omit. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I'd like to add that that one of those key spots, Pilakahaka, of course, has been identified by archaeologists for quite some time, and now there is a historical marker commemorating the site. So people driving on that lonesome road on 471 from Lakeland to Webster, and a little past Webster, of course, can actually see a historical marker, though, which is fairly close to the original site. So I guess that's one of the few things about Florida becoming developed, is we're increasingly developing some of those areas.
Yes.
Archaeologists are discovering things. Anyway, I just really can't say enough about the panel, and I'd like to let everybody, maybe we've had everybody have their say, but I'd like to have everybody maybe have an opportunity to say one thing or another based on what we've been hearing. So I'll start with Jim.
Well, thank you, Mike. I think my comment, having listened to Jason and Susan and Canter, first of all, I loved all of those presentations, and I love the information that came out of them, because it had so many ties to reactions of specific individuals. But the other thing I think it brings out is that this transition, or this session in 1821, was extremely traumatic. I mean, we're seeing in some ways the death or the overthrow of an older society by a newer society. And I think sometimes it can be too easy to just look at 1821 and think that it just marks a temporal boundary. But I think everybody, made the point that this was a very difficult transition for the people who were already in Florida. It was contentious. It was murderous in the case of Angola. And we could add into this, because this is something you would know more about, is that there was all this political infighting occurring among the incoming Americans, which just—
Yes, absolutely. As I made the point that Duval had more problems with many northern factions or northern emigres who were coming in to try to make their living or make their role or their home in Florida, and all the political connections that brought with it, because each of these different factions had kind of clients, or rather they were patrons of these various patrons, or clients of these various patrons. So this made it even more complicated. But of course, internationally, globally, we also called the Adams-Onis Treaty the Transcontinental Treaty, of course, because it separated out the American possessions from Spain, and this was the end of the Spanish, of course, in large part, which was a real traumatic experience for those people who lived in Florida at that time. Susan, would you like to say anything more?
Yes, I appreciated Jim's comment, or agreed with him, that I think this panel has demonstrated, Jim said, the contentiousness, the trauma, the turmoil for all the types of people, and I'm largely basing that on race, because I think that's how this is kind of broken down at this point. How traumatic it was. I think part of it was because I don't know about, I can't speak actually to the Blacks and maybe the Seminoles as much, but certainly the whites in St. Augustine and probably Pensacola, I think sometimes felt like this was a negotiated treaty, but it probably felt more like a defeat and being told what you're going to do rather than a negotiation. The other comment I wanted to make is just one that discussion Canter and I had a long time ago, and he brought it out again in his presentation, that the fighting in Florida over various things over a number of decades is also very personal. Everybody knows everybody from previous fights, and there are old enmities coming in that if you don't understand that, sometimes you don't understand why it's so vicious. And that includes the South Carolinians, the Blacks. It's just that they're very, it's I think, in today's world, we forget sometimes how small a lot of those battles were in comparison to what we think of, the Army and the military today. It was a very, very small army.
I mean, some of those Native Americans who attacked Major Dade knew him before. They might have known him before. Is that what you're intimating?
But they
might have had a grudge against him and
they
past.
had fought each other before.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was personal. Okay, it was personal. They're going to get this guy. Okay. Well, great.
There's that old story that just before, or the moment that ignited the Dade massacre. Now, I don't know if it was Micanopy or not, but one account says it was Micanopy, stands up and points at Dade leading the column and yells, "Dade, Dade." And that's how personal that got, if that account can be believed.
Okay, Jason, do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to share with people?
Yeah, it's, first of all, like I'll do the same thing and echo everything, because whenever I saw this panel being put together, it's like, wow, every single person has appeared in my research at some point in time, right? And actually all four of the panelists that I'm with right now today are literally in the same chapter I'm writing. So that was a fun little thing for me to be able to reckon with. And this word contentious really does come into play. And the thing that I continue to wrestle with right now is not necessarily of 1821, but the contention of 2021, right? This contentious memory over the first Floridians. And what does that mean? Because we're talking about this very contested idea. I've really wrestled in my own time with this idea of, is there a Spanish Florida? What does Spanish Florida mean? Who has control of Florida? And now in our own era, who has control of this memory? So much of our memory, and Canter's written significantly about this, about this cracker memory about the cattle lands, and who gets to claim this ancestry, this very proud tale of Florida. And I think that it's really important that they were constantly going back and talking about this very contested place that was home to these multiple different people with very different sets of agendas, senses of belonging and place. And the stakes are actually very, very high, because as a former high school teacher here in Florida, you see a lot of really interesting variants on this early Florida history that's being told. So the thing I would continue to say is that the thing that was contested was not just the land, the resources, access to those resources, but now even today, this memory is quite in contest today.
Great. Well, I guess that kind of wraps it up. We're coming in within the time frame, I think, pretty well. I want to thank all the presenters, Jim Cusick, Susan Parker, Jason Herbert, and Canter Brown, for this very inspiring and interesting panel. And I hope that the folks that are watching this enjoy it, and they will read more and explore this issue in more depth, because it is very, very interesting and complicated. And the more you read about it, the more questions you have, and the more interesting things come out. So I really thank the panel for their discussion, and I look forward to doing this again sometime.